Hello and good evening to everyone here. Welcome to the 43rd Annual Moreau Lecture here at King's College. I'm Father Michael Wirtz. I'm a Holy Cross religious, a member of the theology faculty, and a member of the Moreau Lecture Committee. The Holy Cross priests and the brothers here at King's College are delighted to sponsor once again this annual Moreau Lecture. We welcome those joining us by Zoom and here in person in the Burke Auditorium. The Moreau Lecture Committee takes very seriously the important opportunity to bring to our campus a respected theologian who can assist us in navigating the signs of our times and draw from our rich heritage of Christian theological inquiry. As you can see in the program, we have invited an impressive group of theologians over the years, and this year is no exception. A word of thanks first to the committee members themselves who facilitated this evening tonight. First to Dr. Jim Ambury, faculty member of the philosophy department, to Father Dan Issing, a Holy Cross religious and chair of our theology department, to Dr. Denise Rebele, faculty member of the education department, and to Dr. Bernard Prusak, faculty member of the philosophy department and director of the McGowan Center for Ethics. Dr. Prusak will serve as our respondent this evening. And so on their behalf, I am honored to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Jean Porter. Dr. Porter is the John A. O'Brien Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where she has taught and researched since 1990. Raised in the farming community of North Texas by parents who were both educators, Dr. Porter understood early on the importance of education and the benefits of intellectual inquiry. As an undergrad, she studied philosophy at the University of Texas, graduating summa cum laude, and after which she moved to New England to study for a Master's of Divinity, which she earned with distinction at Weston School of Theology at Boston College. It was at Yale University, where she continued her theological studies, earning an MA and her PhD. And while the majority of her career has taken place at Notre Dame, she has also served on faculties at Vassar College, the Vanderbilt Divinity School, and Loyola University of Chicago. She has enjoyed fellowships at Emory University, the University of Durham, and Oxford University, both in England. Dr. Porter is the author of numerous articles and 6 books on the history of the Christian moral tradition and its contemporary relevance, including The Perfection of Desire, Habit, Reason, and Virtue in Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, published by Marquette University in 2018, Justice as a Virtue, a Thomistic Perspective, published by Erdman's in 2016, and Ministers of the Law, a Natural Law Theory of Legal Authority, also by Erdman's, which won a Catholic Press Association Book Award in 2011. In 2012, Dr. Porter was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in recognition of her outstanding scholarship. And while other distinguished and proven scholars, such as Dr. Porter, might skirt away from teaching duties, Dr. Porter highly values graduate and undergraduate education. And this semester back at Notre Dame is teaching a foundational theology course for sophomores, as well as master's and doctoral seminars. Her dedication to theological inquiry is inspiring. And her grasp of the complexities of philosophical and theological systems was on display earlier today when she generously facilitated a symposium among the philosophy and the theology faculties here at King's College. Dr. Porter's expertise rests in moral theology of St. Thomas Aquinas and his scholastic predecessors and his contemporaries. She is gifted in assisting us in better understanding how Christian intellectual traditions that might seem far distant and therefore irrelevant do indeed shed light on our modern society. Her talk tonight is titled Natural Law and Natural Rights, the Medieval Origins of a Modern Idea. Please help me in warmly welcoming Dr. Jean Porter. Thank you.
Father Mike, thank you for that excessively kind introduction. And I want to thank the committee, the Moreau Committee, that invited me for the very great honor of speaking with you tonight. And I want to thank everyone I've met in this wonderful community for a really warm welcome and what has so far been a really good day of conversation and for me, a chance to get to know a place that I'm very happy to see. I'd never been here before. And so, as Father Mike indicated, the topic of my paper is Natural Law and Natural Rights, the Medieval Origins of a Modern Idea. And before I go any further, let me ask a basic prudential question, and that is, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good. I sort of thought so, but I thought I'd check. All right. So we typically think of natural rights as a distinctively modern idea, a product of the Enlightenment, together with the scientific method, democracy, and other benchmarks dividing the medieval world from our own. For most of the past century, historians would have agreed more or less with this popular view. But this consensus was forcefully challenged by the Cornell historian Brian Tierney in an essay, Origins of Natural Rights Language, published in 1997. In that essay, he observed that the idea of natural rights was already well established in Western medieval legal discourse by 1300, implying that it first came into currency at an even earlier period. As he goes on to show, by the mid-13th century, canon lawyers recognized some natural rights. For example, a right to take from another in circumstances of dire need. It is important to note that these rights were not simply rhetorical flourishes meant to emphasize the duties that we have to one another. No, rights were construed as moral powers of the individual, which he or she could exercise at will, and in some cases, which could be vindicated in a court of law. Tierney and others have since documented claims to natural rights in many spheres of life in this period, including especially marriage and family life, self-defense, and judicial proceedings. How can we explain the emergence of natural rights at this early point? We can't answer this question completely, of course, but Tierney points to one important factor that we will be examining in greater detail this evening. That is to say, the idea of natural rights emerged together with a strikingly original reinterpretation of the ancient idea of natural law. To quote Tierney, once the term jus naturale, that is natural right or natural law, was clearly defined in this subjective sense, the argument could easily move in either direction. To specify natural laws that had to be obeyed, or natural rights that could licitly be exercised. And canonistic arguments soon did move in both directions. So, Stoic authors, when they wrote of natural law, were thinking mainly in terms of cosmic determinism. The canonists were thinking more in terms of human free choice. Stoic reflections on natural law never led to a doctrine of natural rights. Canonistic reflections did so, and did so quickly. In my remarks this evening, I want to follow up on Tierney's suggestion. More specifically, I will consider some key aspects of the natural law as understood by jurists and theologians in the 12th and 13th centuries, focusing on those elements of natural law which suggest an idea of natural rights. As I hope to show, the conception of natural law in this period was strikingly different from our own assumptions about the natural law. We tend to think of the natural law, for better or for worse, as a more or less clear, specific, and fixed set of moral rules. But medieval jurists and theologians did not understand it in that way. Rather, for them, it was dynamic and flexible, a starting point for moral and legal judgments rather than a set of precepts. This may seem surprising since we are accustomed to think of the Middle Ages as a period of stability, or, depending on your point of view, stagnation, founded in uniform belief and general reverence for a fixed moral order. I don't think the medieval period actually was ever that fixed and stable, but at any rate, the period we are considering, at least in the West, was a period of social change and spiritual enthusiasm, which to a considerable extent reflected a strong sense of the innate freedom and moral authority of the individual. These values were not fully realized then, just as they are not fully realized now. Nevertheless, they shape the ideas of natural law and natural rights in such a way as to reflect these values, and we can learn from them and build on their efforts today. Before proceeding further, let me address a question that may have occurred to you by now. That is, who cares? Why should we be interested in the moral and legal theories and practices of the High Middle Ages, a period far removed from our own? I admit that's a very fair question. I find this period fascinating, but you need a better reason than that. And so here goes. That is, I would suggest that through reflection on the origins of natural rights, we can gain some insight into the significance of this idea for those who first entertained it. This insight, in turn, can help us to think through the significance of natural rights for us today. And that's important because, as you know, or probably know, the meaning and significance of rights claims is widely contested in today's society. It is especially contested among Christians, who sometimes seem to hold diametrically opposed views on the theological significance of natural rights. That is, there are those who hold that natural rights are an indispensable element of Christian morality, while there are others who see the idea of rights as an epitome of everything that has gone wrong in the world and also in the worldly church. I won't try to resolve this dispute this evening, but I do think that the origins of natural rights suggest that the idea is, to say the least, congruent with Christian faith and the ideals associated with it. So, okay, I will take sides, but I won't make a point of it. Okay, so let's turn now to the natural law, and then that will lead us into a closer examination of natural rights. We've already observed that the 12th and 13th centuries were a period of reform, combined with a spiritual intensity that empowered men and women to pursue their own, sometimes quite challenging ideals of holiness. At the same time, they were engaged in processes of institutional creation and social innovation in response to rapidly changing social and even environmental conditions. I won't go into details, but a lot was happening in this period, and it was happening very quickly. And just about everyone who was living through the period felt the need to rethink some fundamental assumptions in some pretty basic ways in order to move forward. And so beginning in the 11th and 11th century going into the early 12th centuries, men and women of affairs began to look for principles to guide them as they tried to address the challenges of a rapidly evolving society. The ancient idea of the natural law presented itself as one such principle. It had the great advantages of antiquity and widespread acceptance. It can be traced back at least to the Roman jurists, whose work was being rediscovered at this time, and it was also embraced by many of the church fathers. It fit nicely with recently developed theories of nature, which offered guidance on the proper ways to interpret naturalness. Above all, it was a scriptural doctrine, or so the scholastics believed. They found references to a natural law in more than one place, but the key text for them appears to have been Romans 2:14, in which Paul says, when Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. And according to a widely consulted medieval commentary on this passage, and I quote, Paul said above that the Gentiles are damned if they act badly and saved if they act well. But the objection is that since they do not have a law, as it were being ignorant of what is good or evil, it would seem that neither should be imputed to them. Contrary to this, the apostle says, even if one does not have the written law, one nonetheless has the natural law, by which one understands and is inwardly conscious of what is good and what is evil, what is vice, insofar as it is contrary to nature, which in any case grace heals. For the image of God cannot be so far removed from the human soul by the stain of earthly desires that none of its lineaments should remain in it. Accordingly, when vice has been healed through grace, the Gentiles naturally do those things which pertain to the law. Grace is not canceled out through nature, but rather nature is healed through grace. Being restored, the law of justice is reinscribed through grace in the interior of the human person. So these remarks identify the instinct guiding the Gentiles with the natural law, which, as we are told, can be obscured but not completely removed through sin. What is more, Paul tells us that the natural law is oriented towards the same values as God's revealed law. The Gentiles do by instinct what the law requires. And the commentary expands upon this point, saying that through the natural law, the individual is inwardly conscious of what is good and what is evil. And on this view, the natural law is not primarily a law code or a set of rules, but rather a kind of moral and juridical first principle, or capacity or power, which generates specific precepts through its own proper operations. This way of construing the natural law is strikingly present in medieval reflections. With very few exceptions, jurists and theologians identify the natural law in the primary sense with either a power of moral discernment such as reason, or else with a very basic first principle through which moral reflection operates, for example, the golden rule. They seem to be downright suspicious of attempts to identify the natural law with specific precepts. I am aware of one anonymous text from this period which does identify the natural law with the rules of the Decalogue, but a later commentator adds a correction to the effect that the natural law is not to be identified with the precepts themselves, but rather with the rational capacity through which precepts are discerned. As this gloss suggests, medieval thinkers go on to associate the natural law in a secondary sense with the Decalogue and with other revealed and natural human laws and practices. Nonetheless, the emphasis falls on the natural law as a power of discernment, rather than on the precepts and practices which can be said in some way or other to stem from natural principles. This line of argument is reinforced by another aspect of the medieval concept of the natural law. That is, on their view, the natural law cannot be identified straightforwardly with currently existing social practices and ideals. Certainly, the natural law can be identified with principles and ideals which are apparently contrary to widely accepted social practices. The jurists in particular repeatedly pose this objection to the idea of a universal natural law, saying, and I quote, "According to the natural law, all would enjoy the same status of liberty, and all things would be possessed in common. These, however, are changed through the law of nations." They don't take this observation, which is surely right as far as it goes, to be a decisive refutation of the idea of natural law, but it is a challenge to any view according to which the proper norms of human conduct can simply be read off of natural principles. As if we could go straight from the natural law to the ideal form of marriage or economic life or social arrangements. Human practices which appear, naturalness as such is not the final criterion for morality, but rather a starting point for reflection on the complex relationships between natural principles and the demands of human life. At the same time, there are some deviations from natural principles which are problematic and in extreme cases unacceptable. Jurists and theologians in this period generally agree that servitude reflects our common sinful conditions, and they take at least tentative steps to attempt to limit the burdens of servitude and to expand the scope of freedom and equality. Their views on private property are more varied. Initially, they condemn the institution, but over time they begin to defend it as a way of safeguarding natural ideals of sufficiency and free access to under current conditions of human life. In any case, the principles of natural law are not directly expressed in social practices, but neither are they annulled by these practices. Rather, social practices and human conventions generally are regarded as the media through which natural law in the primary sense is expressed. By the same token, the natural law properly understood yields normative principles in terms of which actually existing conventions can be evaluated and, where necessary, reformed or even set aside. It should be apparent by now that the natural law as it was understood was not at odds with innovation and social diversity. On the contrary, the natural law could only be put into effect through human activities of interpreting and living out its basic principles. Of course, to a very considerable extent, these processes took the form of customary practices rather than reflective innovation. But the circumstances of the 12th and 13th centuries gave new salience to deliberation and legislation as the proper means of governing society. This way of thinking, in turn, implies a far-reaching and considerable authority for human rational deliberation. Consider, for example, Aquinas' response to the question whether the precepts of the Decalogue can admit of dispensation. He insists that they do not. However, he goes on to say, these precepts of the Decalogue are unchangeable with respect to the formal character of justice which they express. But with respect to their determination through applications to individual acts, whether, for example, this or that counts as murder, theft, or adultery, this indeed is changeable, sometimes only by divine authority, namely in those things which are instituted by God alone, as, for example, marriage, and sometimes by human authority, with respect to those things which are committed to human jurisdiction. For with respect to these things, human persons act as the vicar of God, not, however, with respect to all things. Well, practically speaking, Aquinas' distinction between marriage and other examples of practical determinations is really not that sharp, since the norms governing marriage were in fact being determined at this very period by church authorities. Be that as it may, Aquinas certainly realizes that on any showing, the natural law leaves considerable scope for human discernment. By the same token, this rational power is correlated with authority, at least with respect to those things committed to human jurisdiction. The salient point is that the natural law is not just a principle for moral discernment and innovation, it is also a locus for the exercise of authority, through which rulers and judges can carry out the necessary determinations of the natural law in a binding way. At this point, we turn to the question of natural rights. I want to suggest that the idea of natural rights emerged in this period as a corollary to the interpretation of natural law that I have just sketched. That is, the natural law in this period was understood as being primarily a power or principle for moral and social discernment. As such, it had to be applied or specified in order to be put into effect, and as the medieval jurists quickly realized, this task could not be adequately handled by the community as a whole. It had to be directed by someone in authority, mostly for practical reasons. At the same time, the natural law was also a principle for individual discernment, choice, and action. The scope for the exercise of this principle was not unlimited, of course, but medieval jurists and theologians did recognize that within limits set by the individual and his or her own natural operations, persons could legitimately exercise their own discernment and choice. What is more, to some extent at least, they could do so in such a way as to constrain the choices of others who would otherwise limit their freedom in some ways. In other words, just as the natural law implied the need for political authority, so it also came to be associated with the authority of the individual, him or herself, at least in certain critical respects. This authoritative power over one's life, I would argue, is the basis for the idea of natural rights. Once again, let's turn to Aquinas, who illustrates the way in which an appeal to the natural law could easily move into an affirmation of natural rights. This passage occurs in the course of his discussion of the obligation of obedience. As we might expect, Aquinas defends the general legitimacy of obedience, which he regards as natural and necessary to the functioning of human society. At the same time, he also recognizes that there are limits to the obligation of obedience. These are limited, first of all, by the scope of the commanding authority. For example, a general cannot command his soldiers to pick up his dry cleaning. Moreover, no one can command another to do something sinful. Well, so far, Aquinas is saying more or less what we would expect. But then he adds a final and telling limitation on the obligations of obedience, and I quote, "With respect to those things which pertain to the nature of the body, a human person is not obliged to obey another human person, but only God. because human persons are equal with respect to sharing a common nature. For example, in those things which pertain to the maintaining of the body and the generation of children. Hence, those in a state of servitude are not obliged to obey their lord, nor are children obliged to obey their parents with respect to contracting matrimony or preserving virginity or anything else of this kind. Not only is it the case that no one can be compelled to sin, no one can be required to do something good or even praiseworthy within limits set by the fundamental operations of human nature. We are all equal in respect to all being human, and this fundamental natural equality sets limits to human authority. No individual has the power to compel another to use his or her natural capacities for life and reproduction in a particular way or not to use them. Although Aquinas does not use this language, this is tantamount to saying that each individual has authority over his or her own natural life. And once that authority is recognized, the logic of the claim implies at the very least an immunity from coercion or punishment for one's fundamental choices. And so here we are at least on a trajectory towards claims to natural rights. Whether Aquinas himself makes such claims or not is a disputed point, but it seems we're headed in that direction. At any rate, others in this period, and especially the canon lawyers, did affirm natural rights more clearly and directly. As Tierney's former student, Charles Reed, has demonstrated at some length, the jurisprudence of marriage in the 12th and 13th centuries was structured around interlocking sets of natural rights, including the right to marry and the rights of marriage partners over against each other. In the early 12th century, the canon lawyer Gratian clearly asserted the right of those in a state of servitude to marry. And although this view was contested at first, it was subsequently incorporated into church law in 1155 by a decree of Pope Hadrian IV, which unequivocally affirmed the rights of unfree persons to marry without the approval of their masters. In a similar way, jurists defended the rights of adult children to marry against the wishes of their families. The natural relations between parents and children also gave rise to claims of rights. Children had a right to receive an inheritance, although this right could be qualified in various ways, and parents had the right to refuse baptism for their children, although this right ceased when a child attained the use of reason. Claims of natural rights emerged outside the sphere of family life. We have already mentioned one of the most important of these, namely the right of someone in grave and immediate danger from want of material necessities to take what he or she needs to survive from the possessions of another. As the jurist claims, the goods of creation are naturally meant to serve the needs of men and women, and the institution of property must be set up in such a way as to promote and not hinder this fundamental purpose. Faced with the demands of extreme want, the claims generated by the institution of private property give way to the claim of the needy to take what he or she needs for survival. In such a case, as one jurist says, it is as if the poor person uses his own right and his own thing. What is more, as Tierney goes on to show, this right came to be regarded as a claim having legal as well as moral force. It is one of the benchmarks of a just society that it provides some kind of forum in which claims of this sort can be asserted and enforced. Hence, jurists in this period attempt to devise mechanisms through which the right to surplus wealth could be publicly defended and enforced. As Tierney explains, alongside the formal judicial procedures inherited from Roman law, the canonists developed an alternative, more simple and equitable process known as evangelical denunciation. By virtue of the authority inhering in his office as a judge, a bishop could hear any complaint involving an alleged sin and could provide a remedy without the plaintiff bringing a formal action. From about 1200 onwards, several canonists argued that this procedure was available to the poor person in extreme need. He could assert a rightful claim by an appeal to the office of the judge. The bishop could then compel an intransigent rich man to give alms from his superfluities by excommunication, if necessary. So you give to the poor or you're going to a very bad place. And at this time, this particular threat really carried a lot of force. The right to preserve one's life through appropriating the goods of another presupposes a more fundamental right to preserve one's life, grounded in the natural inclination to stay alive. Jurists and theologians throughout this period recognized a right to self-defense. By the 13th century, they were in a general agreement that the procedural rights of those accused of crime were grounded in this natural right rather than being matters of positive law. This period also saw the rise of political rights, defended in theory, if not always put into practice, including a right to speak out against the policies of one's rulers, and in limited context, a right to participate in elections. It will be clear that for our medieval forebears, claims to natural rights were not seen as contrary to the fundamental spirit of Christianity. On the contrary, in this period, rights claims reflected the Christian commitments out of which they emerged. Most specifically, I would say that they stem from a distinctively Christian conception of the natural law, which was grounded in Scripture as understood in this period and interpreted in the light of that conception. As such, they reflected the perceptions and values that marked the period we have been considering, the perception of the natural law in terms of powers and principles, rather than specific precepts, the sense that the natural law thus understood implies natural relations of authority, and correlatively the recognition that communal authority is complemented and to some degree limited by the individual's authority over his or her own natural life. The medieval conception of the natural law thus implies a worldview, or at least an ideal, in which public authority and personal freedom are not opposed, but play distinctive and complementary roles in private and public life. Of course, the developments that we have been tracing took place a long time ago, and we can now look back on an extensive and by no means always positive range of experiences of rights claims. Given this, can we still learn something from the medieval jurists and theologians who first began to speak of natural rights? I think we can, or at least I think that these reflections offer something of value to those of us who approach the topic from within the standpoint of Christian convictions. So at this point, let's step back from considering the origins of the idea of natural rights and return to the original question motivating our inquiry. That is, once we have placed this idea within its original context, what does this tell us about the theological significance of the idea? The first point that comes to mind is the close interconnection between natural law and natural rights, as jurists and theologians understood them. As Tierney remarks, the idea of natural rights begins to emerge when medieval thinkers begin to associate the natural law with a rational power. This in itself is significant, since for many scholars today, the idea of natural law is diametrically opposed to the idea of natural rights. For these scholars, natural law implies a fixed order, clear and mutually consistent duties and obligations, and an orientation towards the community, whereas natural rights imply autonomy, obligations limited by the individual's own choice, and the assertion of the individual over the community. Medieval jurists and theologians understand the natural law and natural rights in a very different way, as we have seen. And this brings us to our next point. For medieval thinkers, natural law and natural rights were fundamentally theological ideas, even though they also held that the natural law, at least, was also known to non-believers. The point is widely acknowledged, but there is some debate over just what the theological interpretation of natural law implies. Certainly, medieval jurists and theologians identified it with the image of God, as in the commentary on Romans 2:14 indicates, and at different points they associate it with a natural order, which God establishes and now governed, or with the power of reason, which God bestowed on us. But most fundamentally, the existence of the natural law is a scriptural doctrine, and Scripture provides the key for interpreting it. In the letter to the Romans, as we've seen, Paul appeals to a natural power of moral discernment as a principle of freedom, through which the Gentiles are placed on the same plane of responsibility and guilt as the Jews. Medieval thinkers, following the commentary on this text, identified this power with the natural law. They are careful to interpret it in such a way as to avoid any suggestion of Pelagianism, but the jurists and theologians who follow them are less worried about that and more interested in the natural law as a basis for social and individual discernment and self-direction. In particular, reflection on the natural law provided a context for considering the urgent practical questions facing men and women of the times. The natural law is identified as a divinely bestowed power or principle, which served as a basis for social analysis, reform, and innovation. Yet these powers and principles were very general and led to uncertain and non-specific conclusions. In this way, the natural law considered as a basis for social discernment also became a basis for social authority, which could, as it were, fix and stabilize applications of the natural law. In other words, the natural law thus understood is the basis both for law, understood as a rational principle, the moral law, and for law understood as a legal enactment resting on authoritative will. It is a basis for authority because and insofar as it is a basis for rational discernment and choice. At the same time, because it is grounded in the rational natural law, authority thus understood is limited by reasonable principles. Most fundamentally, it is limited by principles of creation in the form of the basic operations of human nature. With respect to these, no man or woman can be said to have domination over another. These natural principles thus set limits to authority. At this point, it is only a short step to the further conclusion that every man and woman has his or her own authority over those matters pertaining to the operations of human nature, rights by nature, or in other words, natural rights. Certainly, these rights affect the operations of the divine image, which after all is identified with rational powers, and they suggest key demands of justice and Christian love. But they are most fundamentally important to the Christian, I would suggest, because they reflect a kind of personal authority of the individual, established through divine wisdom as a complement and as a boundary to the authority of the community. Natural rights, in other words, express a divinely willed zone of human freedom within which men and women can pursue their own ends in accordance with their own best judgments and deepest desires. This line of analysis raises many questions, but I want to focus on one in particular as I conclude this evening. Within Catholic circles especially, claims to natural rights are sometimes viewed with suspicion because they would seem to be contrary to the claims of the common good. I can't address this issue in any detail, but let me offer two observations. The first is that the jurists and theologians were well aware of the claims of the common good and would not readily have supported any doctrine which would tend to undermine it. Tierney remarks that medieval thinkers devoted considerable attention to the respective rights of individuals in the community within corporate groupings, and he goes on to say that inquiry into this aspect of rights theories should remind us that, as I quote him, the first rights theories were not derived from conceptions of the individual isolated from his fellows, but from the reflection on the right ordering of human relations in emerging societies. The jurisprudence of rights that emerged in this period did not presuppose that men and women lived in a state of nature, nor did the rights theorists claim, as modern theorists were later to do, that political authority rests on a collective grant of rights and powers by individuals to the state. On their view, political authority and the authoritative claims of individuals arise together. And on the assumption that we are dealing with well-disposed individuals in a well-ordered society, political authority and individual rights are correlative rather than being set in opposition to one another. Seen within this context, individual rights are not opposed to the common good because the common good itself depends in key part on right relations between our community and the individuals comprising it, including respect for individual rights. But of course, our lives and our societies as we experience them fall very far short of this ideal. Individuals try to impose their will on others, or they neglect their responsibilities, or they try to exploit the communities that they inhabit. Political authorities neglect the needs and the legitimate expectations of those they govern, or worse, they exploit them and violate their rights. Communities become fragmented, or else they solidify into an artificial and oppressive unity. Clearly, in all these cases, the claims of the common good are set aside or violated in some way. At the same time, I would suggest that it is not helpful to construe all these situations in the same terms, as if we could resolve each case by simply appealing to the common good. What is needed in each instance is a set of secondary principles to guide us in dealing with non-ideal situations. We need a theory of conflict resolution or punishment, or processes of setting aside bad laws, or reform and repudiation of oppressive regimes. My point is once again that an appeal to the idea of the common good will not by itself provide us with a basis for addressing the many diverse and complex challenges that face us in our communities and political associations. At any rate, it will be clear by now that a great deal of theoretical and practical work remains if we want to apply medieval ideas of natural law and natural rights to our own very different circumstances. I hope that I have said enough to indicate that it might be worthwhile to consider doing some of this work, or if not, that at the least we have something to learn from medieval thinkers on the very modern topic of natural rights. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Porter, thank you so very much. Our respondent this afternoon is Dr. Bernard Prusak, a professor of philosophy here and the director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. He earned his degrees from Williams College, Exeter College at Oxford University, and Boston University, where he earned a PhD also in philosophy. And before founding the McGowan Center, he taught at Boston University and Villanova University. He's a regular contributor to the periodicals of Commonweal in America, and he is the author or the editor of 3 books, the most recent of which was released just last month, entitled Catholic Higher Education and Catholic Social Thought. This college community of Kings is very blessed by his presence, and we're very grateful that he is our respondent tonight. Please welcome Dr. Bernard Prusak.
Thanks to Father Michael for inviting me to give this response. It's an honor, as I've been reading Jean Porter's work for about 20 years, reading it and learning from it. In fact, my most recent paper draws extensively from a 1999 book of hers, Moral Action and Christian Ethics, which is really a great book. You can hear me back there? All right. So it might help for me to provide a brief summary of what I take to be the main lines of Professor Porter's paper. To begin with, she's arguing against scholars who hold that, quote, the idea of natural law is diametrically opposed to natural rights, end quote. As she remarks, and as I'll discuss further in a few moments, the discourse of rights is widely, even deeply contested in our day and age, and not least among Christians, some of whom criticize rights-based arguments as misleading and ultimately baseless, while others defend human rights as indispensable. Professor Porter claims that it's a mistake to identify natural law, as it was understood by medieval thinkers, with a fixed set of moral rules specifying the demands of justice. And it's likewise a mistake, according to her, to oppose natural rights to the common good of a political society. And by the way, I'll take this opportunity to tell students, when you hear this term common good, an easy way to begin to think about it is to think about goods that can be had only in common. So irreducibly social goods, like a conversation or a party or friendship or marriage or a political society, which is a common good. You can do things to help a common good. Think of a friendship, think of a family, think of a marriage. If you're in it only for yourself, that's a good way to destroy a common good. These common goods are really crucial for our individual flourishing. Instead, she proposes that the natural law should be understood fundamentally as a power of discernment. You heard that a few minutes ago. And thus a basis for social analysis, reform, and innovation. All right, so this is the key. What's discerned is in part the proper limits of political authority, which is limited precisely, and here I'm quoting from the paper, by principles of creation in the form of the basic operations of human nature, end quote. So this point is key. Natural principles, so to speak, set limits to the authority of others, for example, over decisions to marry, whom to marry, decisions to procreate. No one but the individual has dominion or control over the basic natural dimensions of human life, thus giving rise to what Professor Porter calls a kind of personal authority of the individual, established through divine wisdom as a complement and a boundary to the authority of the community. So you have control, you have authority over your natural life, right? So the basic principles of creation. Well, it's not that you have control of the principles of creation, it's that the principles of creation have given you control over your natural life. So decisions touching on, and we'll have to talk about this further, but decisions touching on the basic operations of your human nature, like decisions about to marry, like decisions about self-defense, like decisions about whether to have children. She also suggests that this authoritative power over one's own natural life is the basis for the idea of natural rights, which she claims express a divinely willed zone of human freedom within which men and women can pursue their own ends in accordance with their own best judgments and deepest desires. In claiming that natural rights are rooted in the natural law and that we can find the origins of that development even in the thought of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, Professor Porter opposes such contemporary figures as the Harvard lawyer Adrian Vermeule and the Notre Dame political scientist Patrick Deneen, both prominent Catholics. This argument with figures like that operates in the background of the paper, but it might be helpful for us to bring that argument to the fore a bit, to understand just what the point of contention is. So Vermeule, for example, claims that in what he calls the classical tradition, in which he surely would want to include Aquinas, rights are merely corollaries of justice, which is to say that they're derivative, not foundational. For Vermeule, rights are founded in the injunction of justice. So it's the injunction of justice that's primary, right? That's the foundation, to give every person what is due to her. Not because she has rights as an individual subject living her own life, but because justice objectively demands that, for example, she be given bread to eat if she's starving, or she be given an education as a child. Similarly, Deneen holds that the classical tradition, they love, by the way, to invoke the classical tradition, but the classical tradition sense of rights, but he claims that such rights were always linked to duty. So again, not foundational themselves, but corollaries of justice. So it's the demands of justice that are foundational. On his account, liberalism, by contrast, decouples rights from duties, such that individuals now make claims, for example, to a right to medical assistance in dying on the mere grounds that it's their right to decide how to die, without any consideration of how the political community as a whole might be affected. Professor Porter gives us a different perspective. On her account, the notion of rights as moral powers of the individual isn't foreign to and subversive of the natural law tradition, but an outgrowth of it. On another intellectual plane, so different level altogether, Professor Porter also disagrees, but again in the background, with the distinguished moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who's another Catholic for what it's worth, who for several decades has persisted in his view that human rights are fictions, his word, potentially useful for some rhetorical purposes, but at the end of the day, without a hold in reality. According to MacIntyre, nothing like our concept of a right is to be found in the High Middle Ages or earlier. He dates its emergence to the 14th century with the failure, an emphasis on failure, of Christian theologians to come to terms with disputes over the nature of Christian community, status of property within it. On his telling, the discourse of natural rights comes into its own and becomes dominant with the breakdown. So again, key, breakdown, failure, breakdown of an overall conception of the ultimate human good, in terms of which it might be rationally determined what is due to whom. So let me just say a little bit more about McIntyre. So we've got this overall conception of the ultimate human good. Given that we have that, then we can have rational arguments about what is due to whom. All right, so we need that overall conception of the good, according to him, before we can figure out what it is that justice demands. In a nutshell, simplifying, when that breaks down, that's when the discourse of rights comes to the fore. All right, so for him, it's the failure of medieval theologians and jurists, thinkers, to come to terms with the nature of property, nature of Christian community, that really gives power to this natural rights discourse. All right, in other words, people start turning first and foremost to the discourse of rights. This is McIntyre again. When a shared sense of justice is lost, when what is due to whom can no longer be discerned in light of a common set of beliefs and commitments about the requirements of our life together. For McIntyre, the upshot is that the dominant contemporary idiom and rhetoric of rights cannot serve genuinely rational purposes. Instead, for him, it has become a cacophony of endlessly contestable claims that we try to use courts to decide in our favor as we wish things to be. According to McIntyre, it follows that we ought not to conduct our moral and political arguments in terms of rights, since to do so is to entangle ourselves in error and to perpetuate the confusion that in asserting a right to this or that, we've done anything more than to say that we want it to be so and we want courts to back us up. To use my earlier example of medical assistance in dying, we want to be able to die how we want to die, and we want courts to recognize a federal or at least state constitutional right in our support. McIntyre goes on to remark that it shouldn't surprise us that claims to rights keep multiplying, since on his analysis, quote, the absence of any shared form of rational justification for claims to rights is accompanied by an absence of any shared criterion for identifying what particular rights there are, end quote. It isn't the aim of Professor Porter's paper to respond to McIntyre or even to Vermeule and Deneen. We were talking beforehand, it will be the aim of a book of hers. So coming in probably 2 or 3 years, something like that. More modestly, over and against such figures, very much in the background, she seeks to support the claim that the origins of natural rights suggest that this idea is at least congruent with Christian faith and the ideals associated with it. But to bring this response to a close, let's imagine some questions that a figure like McIntyre might ask Professor Porter. Suppose he were to agree with her scholarship, as I think he should, that natural rights are rooted in the natural law, opposed neither to it nor in principle to the common good of a political community, which to the contrary, as she explained at the very end of her paper, can be achieved only by respecting individuals' natural rights. Here's the first McIntyre-inspired question. Granting that there is a trajectory from the high medieval natural law tradition to natural rights claims, hasn't the discourse of rights that's familiar to us moderns overshot that trajectory? In other words, even if the discourse of rights that's familiar to us evolved from natural rights of yore back in the 13th or 14th centuries, aren't rights today, having passed through the hands of philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and others, a very different animal, different not only in degree, but in kind? Consider former Justice Anthony Kennedy's oft-quoted, sometimes derided claim in Planned Parenthood versus Casey from 1992. If you read any legal literature, you'll come across this, that quote, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life, end quote. That claim makes it clear that we're no longer in medieval Paris. It comes instead from a very different moral universe. To put this question then a bit more in my own voice, when we're considering natural rights in the context of medieval law and the discourse of rights in our own day and age, Should we emphasize more of the continuities or the discontinuities? So that's the first, again, McIntyre-inspired question. Second, I can imagine McIntyre wondering about the criteria for identifying particular natural rights. Professor Porter suggests that the logic of the claim that, quote, each individual has authority over his or her own natural life implies, at the very least, an immunity from coercion or punishment for our fundamental choices, end quote. So to bore down a bit here, what makes choices fundamental? From a different angle, how expansive is the zone of human freedom generated by the basic operations of human nature or our natural life? Professor Porter has shown us that the medievals recognized that zone to encompass decisions over whom to marry and whether to have children. The right to self-defense likewise appears rooted in our authority over our natural life. Does this authority extend, however, to the use of contraception? Does it extend to abortion? Does it extend to medical assistance in dying? To be clear, I'm not suggesting here that it would be good or bad if our authority over our natural life did extend to contraception, abortion, and medical assistance in dying. So those are different questions or arguments altogether. And each of those, contraception, abortion, medical assistance in dying, if these needs to be stated, is really quite different from the others. Instead, my McIntyre-inspired question is how we discern what counts as a fundamental choice touching on our natural life, and for that reason properly shielded from the interference of political authorities. What are the criteria for that determination? It's a great merit of Professor Porter's paper that it indicates the relevance of the medievals to that very modern and pressing question. So thank you again.
Dr. Porter, if you would like, you can give an answer to Dr. Prutzak, and then we have other questions for the broader audience. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Bernard, for that very kind and insightful and beautifully clear response. And, thank you for your pressing questions. It would take a long time to answer these questions in any detail, and I want to hear from others in the audience. I mean, let me just briefly say, first to the question of whether the idea of rights as we understand it has overshot the medieval conception. I think maybe not as much as we might think. That would be my first comment. My second comment would be that if you take any of the key political concepts, law itself, democracy, ideas of dignity, freedom, all of these have deep medieval origins and long and complicated modern and contemporary histories. And, this is what we do, what we do when we do what we do. Those of us who work in this area, we get down and we look at the different claims and we try to sort it out. And I don't think I can do this tonight, but I think it can and should be done. With respect to the criteria question and what am I going to say about the hard cases? Well, I wondered if someone was going to ask me about the hard cases, and so Bernard got it over with. And to prove I'm not a coward, I'm going to answer him. First, with respect to contraception, I think unquestionably, this should be a legally guaranteed right. And I'm not making a judgment on whether it's morally right or wrong. But if the view of rights has any purchase at all, I think it has to include some rights to do immoral things. At the same time, I'm not saying that the use of contraceptives is immoral. I'm just saying whether it is or not, this kind of fundamental choice of reproductive freedom, I think pretty clearly would fall within the scope of natural rights. Abortion is a hard case because your views on abortion are going to depend in part on your views on the status of the fetus. I think it's pretty clear, at least to me, it seems pretty clear that women have a right to control over their bodies and a right to reproductive choice, again, on the same grounds of basic human tendencies to reproduction. The question is whether and in what ways the rights of the fetus conflict with this. Being a Thomist, I believe that rational human life does not begin at conception. It begins at a certain point later when the body of the fetus is well formed enough to sustain the functioning of a rational soul. And so I would say myself that the rights of the woman are overriding in the early stages of pregnancy. I think after that, we have to think more about it. But obviously, there's a very, very long discussion to be had there, which we may or may not have tonight, but at any rate, that's what I think. The same thing with medical assistance in dying. I've thought a lot about this, and I have to say that I cannot see any principled objection to recognizing a right to end one's life. And again, I'm not saying that's a good thing to do. I'm not saying that's a morally supportable choice. I am saying that it's the kind of choice that people arguably should be free to make. I think the question of medical assistance is trickier, a lot trickier, because it's a demand for a collaboration in what is, by any account, a deeply ambiguous choice. And so I don't know what I want to say about assisted suicide as such, but I do think the right to end one's life probably is a natural right. So that should be enough controversial claims to be sort of get us started. And so with that out of the way, let me just turn then to everyone else's questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Porter. So I have a microphone here. If you have a question, if you want to raise your hand, I'll come up to you so we can all hear the question. We have a bit of time for Q&A. Yes. Okay.
So you spoke early on about the realization of legal and moral values in the medievals and contemporaries. Do you believe that prudence and virtuous living are prerequisites to the realization of moral and legal values, or rather concurrent achievements?
I want to answer that question very carefully because there are two things I want to say. On the one hand, I want to, as we say, interrogate the assumption that unless we as a society hit a certain level of virtuousness and moral goodness, that not only do we have no hope of attaining rights, we really have no point in even talking about it or anything else. In other words, that would be a strong view of perfectionism. We go for the moral good or nothing. At the same time, I think it is impossible to deny that if a society is not made up of well-disposed people, at least people who meet a threshold of basic decency most of the time, and if the rulers of society don't meet a threshold of a genuine and dominating concern for the overall good of society, then you can have the best and most profound principles you want, and it's not going to help. So I would say, no, we don't need to achieve perfection in virtue, but yes, we need to get up over a certain threshold of concern for one another and for the common good and for principles of right order and good governance. And if we don't go over that threshold, then no theorizing in the world is going to save us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. I just want to admit up front that I probably read too much McIntyre and too little Porter. So please forgive me for that.
Oh, I don't know.
My question is around, I'm going to lean into kind of Professor Bernard's first question a little bit, and just ask, though, in particular on the reality of our globalized world and how that might impact the question. So I think of the common good as a somewhat helpful framework, as I think of, say, the Rohingya in Bangladesh and how their good in some way is connected to mine. Could you maybe help me think of how this conversation around natural rights might be useful in a globalized world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And what makes it a good question, paradoxically, is that the notion of natural rights does not seem to be a cultural universal. So, I mean, let's just put that on the table right away. This does seem to be a Western conception. So what good is it? Well, I've actually thought about that, and here's what I would say. An idea of rights is not a cultural universal, but what does seem to be a cultural universal is a value on a certain kind of freedom. A freedom of the individual within the community to make some kind of claim and to get it heard. And then the freedom of the community to get some kind of freedom as a political/cultural entity. And without invoking rights as such, I think that we can use our own ways of appropriating these more general ideas, including our ideas of rights, as a starting point for thinking through what's really at stake. Both in the internal and the external struggles of peoples. And internally, I think that we can and should hold it out as a standard of at least minimal decency in a society, that at least everybody has some chance to be heard and to have their claims dealt with and acknowledged in some public forum. It might not be an equal chance, it might be a mediated chance, but at least let's say that this threshold is valuable. I think we should also think in terms of statuses of communities, and I bring that up because some people, and I'm thinking here especially of someone named Samuel Moyn, have made the argument that at critical points we've invoked the language of rights as a way not to talk about communal self-determination, which I think is a fair criticism. And so I think, okay, so let's bring the question of communal self-determination back and think about what's involved in defending the claims of the Rohingya, for example, or other groups that are marginalized in various ways. And that's not a language of rights as such, but it's a way of going back and reclaiming parts of the conversation that were obscured by what I think was a misuse of the idea of rights. And so part of a larger project that the reflection would generate.
Other questions? Yes.
Thanks. My question is just about one of the very last things that you said when you're talking about contraception, abortion, and medical assisted suicide. At the end, you said that the medical assisted suicide was the more kind of tough one because it required collaboration, right? And the first thing that came to my mind was, well, the other two require collaboration as well, right? If it's a medical abortion, the doctor has to be involved. If it's a medicinal one, you have somebody to make that pill. Same thing with contraception. And so to my mind, they're equally tough questions. So maybe I misunderstood what you meant by collaboration. So I guess I'm just asking for some clarification, or what you think about that. That's it. No,
I think that's a fair point, which does complicate all three. Well, I think not so much contraception. I think the methods of contraception are pretty straightforward and generally available, and don't involve the direct involvement of third parties in whatever is going on. But I do get the point of comparison between abortion and aid in dying. And yes, I mean, I think in both cases that does add a level of ambiguity and complexity in what I think what we already know are deeply ambiguous and complex questions.
Thanks.
I'm a bit of a question. I hope I articulated it more. But you spoke of national law and national rights in regards to things like, survival, life and liberty. And third one is you generally acknowledge the United States as happiness. So this focus of natural law and national rights related to life and liberty. Do you have anything to say about the relation and role between natural law, natural rights, and happiness? I don't know if the individual scholars have anything to say about that. I'd love to hear a little bit.
It's a modern idea, the idea of the pursuit of happiness, which means generally, I think, a right to try to pursue the normal satisfactions of life, to go out, to found a family, to work, and so on. the medievals don't speak in that way. I mean, first of all, so if we would look for an antecedent to this, it would be in the development of the idea, not in what I'm starting with. I think the idea broadly of the pursuit of happiness is a good idea. If we want to get down and get gritty and analyze it, I suspect it would be more a way of talking about a convergence of rights rather than as a specific right in itself. I mean, what I think the scholastics have in mind would be very basic things having to do with the basic operations of the body. So, you have a right to physical subsistence. You have a right to reproduce, although remember for them, the right to reproduce includes a right to educate your children. So it's not just a basic physical right. You have a right to the control of your own sexuality, at least with respect to marriage or virginity. So, these kind of self-defense, I don't want to leave that out. So the more sorts of complex rights, I think we'd have to start thinking about them in a more with a more expanded set of concepts. But this gives us a start.
Questions?
Don't step on the dog.
No. So my question is, with all this talk of natural law, natural rights, as we are here in Catholic College, the assumption is, and we talk about economics and such, right? Talking about from a Christian perspective, from a theist perspective, is there, do you think, room for natural law and natural rights from an atheistic perspective? And how do you think that would differ from the current conversation that we're having?
Well, what I would say is this, that the authors that I'm talking about, and I think this would be pretty universal, not just Aquinas, they think that the natural law is grounded in fundamentals, which are, so to speak, built into the human psyche itself. Now, there's some back and forth about whether, apart from grace and its healing effects, these principles can be operative. But as you move through this literature, the sense seems generally to be that, yes, they think that the pagans, whatever you want to call them, can share in discernment of the natural law. And they also, I think more importantly, acknowledge that Christians can stand under political obligations to non-Christian rulers. And in fact, they say things like grace does not set aside nature, and that's their explanation. As for rights, they recognize the rights of non-Christians. Most critically, I think for our purposes, the right of non-Christian parents to refuse baptism for their children, which is pretty basic. So they would expect to find some overlap. How would the conversation look different if it started from this point? That's very hard for me to say. I would just add to that I am more and more convinced as I read this, that when they quote Romans as the starting point for their own way of reading the natural law, that isn't just window dressing. It isn't a way of shoring up a concept they arrive at in other grounds. I think as a matter of fact, they get this through their reading of scripture. And if that's the case, then I don't think we would expect other communities without that scripture and without reading it in that way to move in the same direction. Which goes back to the earlier point. I mean, the idea of rights is not a cultural universal, although it seems to be grounded in certain cultural universals.
I think we have time maybe just for one more question.
So in regards to the assertion of rights that have to involve a third party, do you think that it is fair to say that that assertion of rights prevents the prohibition of those rights, but it's also the third party's right to express not participating in that person's right?
And put in that general way, I think that's a very hard question to answer, because when you look at it, I think in contextual detail, almost any rights claim is going to involve the collaboration of some third parties. There's a man named Henry Shue wrote a very good book on this, in which he argues that every rights claim presupposes the conditions for exercising the right, including basic sufficiency and security. And then if you look at more specific rights, there's got to be a structure that's built up in order for the right to be exercised. I think the real problem with abortion and euthanasia, obviously, is that so many people have deep moral problems with it. And so it seems that requiring people to participate in this would look like a way, like trying to safeguard one right by violating another. I know that this is a really difficult question. It's practically difficult, but I would say that in these kinds of cases, there ought to be at least an opt-out clause. That people who have deeply seated opposition to these practices should not be forced to participate in it. And then think through other ways in which, if we think we ought to guarantee these rights, we can do it without requiring them to do so. I mean, that's an imperfect solution, but I think in these kinds of cases, imperfect solutions are all we're going to get.
Dr. Porter, thank you so much. I think this evening proves that theological and philosophical inquiry is just so very important in the life of today. Thank you so very much to all of you for being present. Help me to thank Dr. Porter one more time.